Beautiful, sweet spirit A-pushers. We are now on to our last lecture of the year. However, I will warn you, this is going to be a very, very long lecture. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster than normal because of how many slides and how much content we have to go over. But it is, of course, the very, very last lecture of the entire year. Woo! Okay. So we're going over our key themes of our last unit, 1890 to 1945. We talked about American imperialism in this time period, especially the annexation of Hawaii, the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani, the Spanish-American War. 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president after McKinley's assassination, that starts our progressive era that will go until 1914. Once 1914 comes around, that's World War I. So now we are abandoning our progressive ways and we are going into fight the war. The prevailing change after World War I is a huge reemergence back into isolation, especially because of the resistance to the Treaty of Versailles, in which made the U.S. or proposed the U.S. joining the League of Nations, which of course the U.S. doesn't do. After the war, we see three very, very distinct and different decades: the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s, which will be the last 3 decades that we discuss in our course. The 1920s are a very, very profitable time for most of the citizens in the United States. The United States benefited amazingly from World War I. They initially shipped with both sides, shipped both to the Central Powers and the Allies. Then once Germany especially was blockaded in the Central Powers, lots of war orders going to Britain and France. This made a tremendous amount of money for the United States. And then after the war, as these countries are recovering, their factories need to be rebuilt. The United States sold a tremendous amount of manufactured goods to make even more wealth and prosperity. So the 1920s domestically, a very, very luxurious time for the United States. And when there's a very luxurious time, you are going to see conservative politics. You're going to see high tariffs. You're going to see laissez-faire style government, which is exactly what we see in the 1920s. Also, internationally, we also see a growing fear in communism because the Bolshevik Revolution has occurred in Russia. Thus, how does that send shockwaves into the United States? We have our first Red Scare, our fear of communism. This is going to, unfortunately, have a negative effect on immigration, and we see major immigration changes in this time period. It's also a big blow for unions, because unionism is equated with socialism, which is seen as terrible, right? So we see the weakening of unions in the 1920s. Also, isolationism, big time isolationism in the 1920s, not wanting to ever be drawn back into a war again. And then that's when the 1930s, of course, come in. And internationally, in the 1930s, the United States is burying its head in the sand, ignoring the rise of fascism in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, and saying these are European problems. This isn't going to be a problem for us until, of course, finally the moves in the late 1930s that finally start to draw the United States out of its isolation. Of course, the 1930s domestically, the Great Depression and the New Deal. We've got a lot of New Deal policies that we need to discuss. And then 1939 to 1945, that is officially World War II. World War II starts with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. With the invasion of Poland, the U.S. Is going to wake up. In fact, they really wake up, especially less than a year later with the fall of France in June of 1940, start a draft and then start indirectly supporting Britain. These are our key themes and dates. Here are some key dates right here. Again, and we have a lot of key dates and themes in this time period because there's a lot of content. This is our biggest content period. We've got everything we've discussed last lecture. We are going to talk about the changes in immigration. These are our last big immigration laws, 1921 and 1924. The stock market crash, of course, in 1929, which is the catalyst for our Great Depression. FDR shifting the Democratic Party to what it is today. And then, of course, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Our must-know terms right here, we will, of course, go over each and every one of these terms. We hit pretty much everything on the left-hand side besides the Red Scare in our last lecture, and we will discuss the Red Scare right away here. So, of course, the Red Scare, the catalyst is the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 with the Russian a majority revolution in Russia that is going to overthrow the Tsar and seize power and, of course, attempt to redistribute the land and the wealth throughout the country, creating a communist Russia. This has been a fear of the United States for quite some time, a rising stem of socialism. And because of this, and because the United States is the most capitalist country in the world and the biggest manufacturing country in the world, there is a huge concern that socialism will sweep throughout the world, just as Karl Marx predicted in his Communist Manifesto. And so we see this huge paranoia in the United States of communism. The face of the first Red Scare is Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Of course, McCarthy is our face of the second Red Scare, which will be after World War II. We no longer are responsible for that material, but of course, it's good knowledge to have. A. Mitchell Palmer is fearful that especially new immigrants that are coming into the United States are bringing their socialist ideas with them. And he's especially going to target illegal immigrants that have entered the country. He's going to order federal agents to go in and investigate and round up thousands of U.S. aliens, arrest them without a trial, and then look and see if they have any ties to communism. Some of them didn't even get a chance to prove that they were not related to the Communist Party. They were sent back to Russia, 249 aliens sent back to Russia. Just like McCarthy, though, A. Mitchell Palmer eventually is going to lose credibility because many of these people he has accused are not, in fact, actually tied to the Communist Party. Both of our Red Scares start with this era of paranoia and then start to die out as people start to get saner heads. But in the beginning, things are crazy. And certainly when we look at 1919 to 1920, this is right after World War I. We've got the Red Scare is at its height, and we see states starting to pass these anti-red statutes, which say that it's illegal to advocate violence to secure social change, as many of the calls of socialists over in Russia were the workers of the world to come in and unite. Well, there's a big difference between throwing fits and throwing bombs. Just because you advocate violence doesn't mean you're committing violence. And that is a question of, is this a violation of Americans' First Amendment rights and freedom of speech? Probably yes. It probably is a violation of Americans' First Amendment rights. But who are the people that were really advocating for violence to secure social change? There were our international workers of the world, our wobblies. And because of this, our wobblies are the ones that are especially thrown in jail because of these anti-red statutes, once again targeting unions, especially radical unions, in the Red Scare. Also in New York, 5 legally elected members of their state assembly were denied their seats just because they were socialists. 2 of them, there was a special assembly. 2 of them were actually allowed to take their seats. 3 of them weren't. The 2 that were allowed to take their seats resigned in protest. And so that's how bad it gets here in the initial years of the Red Scare. And the long-term effect of the Red Scare, again, is that labor unions are going to be set back. If we want to look at it in this way, we had the biggest strike in American history in 1919 with the steel strike. After that steel strike, which collapsed, which failed for labor, we don't see labor unions rise up or get more membership and more power again until we get into the Wagner Act in the New Deal with FDR. Okay. We also see at this time fear, again, of immigrants, especially immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Our second wave of immigration from 1880 to 1920 are going to be these new immigrants who are less like the predominantly white Protestant United States. And because of this, People like Sacco and Vanzetti were targeted as dangerous, as associated with Catholicism or anarchism, what have you. And in fact, these two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were both dangerous men. I mean, you could say that they were anarchists. They avoided the draft during the war. And so they both were in an organization that was being investigated by the FBI. And in fact, that same organization had bombed A. Mitchell Palmer's house. And so these two men were under heavy investigation. And then there was a robbery of a shoe factory. And these two men were accused, and they were put on trial for robbing this factory and killing someone in the process. Well, it turns out that in the investigation, there weren't any hard evidence against these two. And in fact, there was an actual sworn testimony, a confession by a participant saying, one, I did it, and two, these two men are not guilty. Regardless, they're found guilty anyway, despite conflicting ballistic evidence, and they are executed 7 years later by electric chair. This is kind of the high point in this fear and paranoia of immigration and anarchism coming from Southern and Eastern Europe during the Red Scare. Unfortunately, another thing that happens when we have this high level of immigration is a surge in the KKK. KKK are going to surge 3 times in American history. One, right after the Civil War. That makes sense because we have abolition, because we have emerging the first civil rights era with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The second time that it's going to surge is in the 1920s with this huge amount of immigrants coming into the United States. And then the last time it's going to surge is after World War II in the integration era, the desegregation era. So KKK membership actually rises to its highest point at this stage. We have 5 million due-paying members in the United States in this time period, and they actually controlled, they were so powerful, they actually controlled part of state politics. Illinois had several due-paying members of the KKK, and to a lesser extent, Oklahoma and Texas. Our KKK are just about anti-everything that isn't white Protestant. They are anti-Jewish, obviously anti-Black, anti-Catholic, and they certainly rear their ugly heads as a terrorist organization when we have these high levels of immigration coming into the country. They will collapse at the end of the 1920s, but one of the things, excuse me, excuse me, I'm so sorry. One of the things that they are especially going to advocate for is prohibition and enforcement of prohibition. The KKK, especially in the Midwest and the South, where prohibition was most popular. And so the KKK is actually going to want to enforce prohibition. Okay, when you have these high levels of immigration, you have these nativists calling for limits on immigration, and we do see a substantial, 2 substantial laws when it comes to limiting immigration. The first one is the Emergency Quota Act. Now you can see those statistics. There were 800,000 immigrants coming in between 1920 and 1921. That's a huge amount of people coming in, and 2/3 of them are from Southern and Eastern Europe. Finally, Congress is going to come in and regulate this flow of immigrants. They passed this Emergency Quota Act, which restricts yearly immigration to 3% of people of their respected nationality who's been living in the United States since 1910. Lot to cover here. So 3% of people of their nationality who have been living in the U.S. since 1910. So what that means is if you have immigration, let's say, coming from Great Britain, and the United States is going to use the census of 1910. How many people do we have of that nationality living here? There's a huge amount of people of that nationality, and therefore we're going to allow 3% more to come in annually every year. Now, why have they set it up like this? What's the purpose of this? Well, the Emergency Quota Act is there because it is going to allow the more immigration from the people that already make up the highest nationalities in the United States. It's going to allow, for instance, more immigrants coming from Great Britain than it is from people coming from Russia or from Croatia or from Poland, what have you. And so this is discriminatory to new immigrants coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe. But if you pick 1910, which this first Emergency Quota Act was, there have been new immigrants coming into the country for 30 years. They first started coming in around 1880. And so this is relatively favorable to people from Southern and Eastern Europe. That changes 3 years later with the Immigration Act of 1924. This stifles immigration much more. This is much more unfavorable to certain groups because not only does it cut the quota from 3% to 2%, it shifts the national origin census to 1890. And it does that because far less immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe had made it into the United States by 1890. Thus, they're purposely limiting certain groups from coming into the United States. So this is the end of the free immigration era, with the obvious exception of the Chinese, which were stopped in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. The other group that's going to be targeted is Japanese immigration. And we've had some really, really ugly disputes with the Japanese because of overt racism, especially in California. We last discussed Japanese immigration in 1907 with the Gentleman's Agreement, which was when the San Francisco School Board was segregating students into schools, segregating Asian students into different schools. The Japanese government was incensed by this. Teddy Roosevelt negotiates this top secret gentleman's agreement, which was already halting Japanese immigration. Now this officially, legally halts Japanese immigration. They do not halt, this law does not halt immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Still, Canadians and Latin Americans could come in when they chose. As I mentioned, this marks the end of the unrestricted immigration era with the exception of the Chinese. So this is a big landmark situation, a big change in immigration in the United States. Okay, the 1920s is Prohibition. This is the time where we talk about it is illegal to manufacture or sell alcohol pursuant to the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. It's, as I mentioned, especially popular in the South and the West. Down in the South, because Southern racists believe that blacks would drink and then it would make them rebel against whites or burst out of their quote unquote place in the racial codes of the Jim Crow South. And then in the West, where you've seen lawlessness for a long time, with free-flowing drink and prostitution and crime, this was viewed as a necessity to establish some order out in the Western states. And so Prohibition popular in the middle of the country and the South, but of course, who is going to be most against it? The larger Eastern cities, with our wet immigrants especially. But Prohibition is doomed from the get-go. For one, this is really the major time where the United States government is trying to come in and affect Americans' private lives and tell them what they can consume and what they can do and what they can't. And so there's going to automatically be a strong resistance to this because the United States traditionally has a strong resistance to central government controls. The federal government from the get-go is understaffed and being able to come in and regulate the entire country of who is manufacturing or selling alcohol. And then an illicit trade of alcohol and manufacturing starts to mushroom, where we see these speakeasies, these private bars in which you would have to knock on the door and whisper softly for entry. And of course, the bootlegging, the illegal manufacture of alcohol. This is also going to bring in the golden age of gangsterism, especially because illegal alcohol trade was so profitable. And so we saw fortunes made over the illicit alcohol trade. And then to be able to control this trade and the mixture of illegal trades that came with it, like drug smuggling and drug distribution, we saw gangs start to sweep up and compete for control and wealth. Some of them involving the police, bribing the police, using automatic weapons or sawed-off shotguns in the streets. I mean, this was the golden age of gangsterism, absolutely, and Chicago was the center of it. Chicago was the place where the most of the shootings and murders of gangster-related crime occurred. And of course, the face of those gangster-related crimes were none other than Al Capone, aka Scarface, who made millions in the illegal drug trade, or excuse me, alcohol trade and drug trade. Probably murdered close to 100 people, never caught for murder, never caught for illegal trade, arrested for tax evasion in 1932. Wow. Okay, another thing in the 1920s is this shift of way of thinking, kind of into a more modern sense. We see in the 1920s for the first time more Americans living in the cities than they are living in the countryside. And this is kind of the clash between the traditional way of living and this new modern way of living, this fast-paced life. And so is especially epitomized in the religious conversation, where we have the fundamentalists are believing that everything in the Bible is literally correct. Everything that is in the Bible happened and is should be strictly interpreted. And now we have the rising idea that evolution is a real scientific fact, and so we have these really intense debates over whether or not you are allowed to teach evolution in schools. Now, more and more states are embracing evolution, but there are some states, all in the Bible Belt, the Midwest and the South, that are still resisting the teaching of evolutions in schools. One such state is Tennessee, where we see our Scopes trial, or the monkey trial, as it is called, because we look at evolution. It was labeled, especially by the fundamentalists, as this monkey business. And so John Scopes, he is a biology teacher. He's a young teacher. He teaches evolution in Dayton, Tennessee, and he is charged for breaking the law. He's supposed to be fined $100, and he's going to fight this. The ACLU is going to come in, the American Civil Liberties Union, to protect him. They're going to raise money to hire the most famous defense lawyer in the entire country, Clarence Darrow, who is going to come in and argue on behalf of Scopes. And because he has brought such this famous defense lawyer, the prosecution then is going to go out and hire the three-time Democratic presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, to come in and argue on the behalf of the Bible. This is classic. The trial of the century, it's called, and there is a hot debate over it. And in fact, literally hot. It is quite hot in Tennessee. They have to move out to the courtyard, and Darrow gets William Jennings Bryan on the stand, and he is asking him question after question about the Bible. Did you believe that Jonah lived in the body of a big fish for 3 days? These kind of questions. And he is trying to make William Jennings Bryan sweat up there, and to make him look like his way of thinking is impossible. And in the end, Scopes is found guilty. He has, in fact, taught evolution in a state which that is illegal. He is fined $100, but actually the fine is set aside on the technicality. But it doesn't matter so much about the end of the trial. It is really what the trial meant. And the trial meant that fundamentalism, at least in this case, was made to look silly. Clarence Darrow made William Jennings Bryan look a little bit befuddled up there on the stand. And many more Christians now started to look at evolution and merge it with their traditional beliefs. And this is kind of a sign of the changing times between the very traditionalist America to this new modern America in the 1920s, where we see this sexual revolution, where we see women have political power more than ever before and have this social rebelliousness, the jazz age, all of these things of the 1920s. Okay, we also see the 1920s is major production. This is the United States, the most powerful manufacturing country in the world. The factory system is humming. We've got new machines. We've got electricity in more factories than ever before. And we are mass producing goods that the rest of the world wants to buy. And the biggest example of this is cars, the automobile industry. By 1930, Americans own over 30 million cars. There's enough cars in the United States to go bumper to bumper all the way around the world. By the time we get to the stock market crash in 1929, Americans have 4 million more cars than the rest of the world combined. So we have lots of manufacturing in the United States, especially automobiles. But can Americans all afford automobiles? For the most part, actually, yes. However, they can't afford the down payment, but no problem. You can buy on credit. You can put down a small down payment and pay as you go. And so many Americans start to do this for just about everything. They start to do it for cars, but then they start doing it for these new vacuum cleaners that have just emerged and washing machines. And all of a sudden, Americans are living far beyond their means. But so what? 1920 is such a profitable time, so much money flowing into the country that nothing bad is going to happen anytime soon. So let's live beyond our means and have more leisure time, etc. Of course, the problem is that millions of Americans are going into debt. And in 1929, when the stock market crashes, this is going to spell a much, much worse depression than our country has seen, because so many Americans are already in debt and can't pay off those installments that they have promised as they bought with a small down payment. Sports becomes big business in the 1920s, especially because of the wealth in the country, the amount of leisure time that people have, being able to spend on ticket sales. Also, with the radio, sports becomes a big business because people can listen in, obviously, to the fight or to the game. This is the era of Babe Ruth becoming one of the, if not the most well-known person in America because of his home run exploits in Yankee Stadium. And then boxing becomes a major, major sport in this era. Everyone listening to the fights on the radio. Back to the automobile, the biggest impact of the 1920s is the automobile on the economy because of how many cars are sold. Obviously, this is going to have an impact with the consumers purchasing cars, but it's also going to have an impact on the entire economy in general. First of all, the steel industry is going to flourish with this. The rubber industry is going to flourish with this, but also the people that pave the roads, gas stations, mechanics, all of these things. You have to build street lights. You have to build, I mean, there's an incalculable amount of changes that occur when you have so many new cars out on the streets. And so this is going to drive the American economy in a very big way. Detroit becomes the motor car capital of the United States. However, we are going to see one of the pillars of the American economy fall from grace very quickly, which is the railroad, which many had invested in heavily, obviously, and where millionaires were made in the Gilded Age. The railroad falls from grace quite spectacularly with the emergence of the automobile. Of course, Henry Ford is the face of automobile production, especially because of the moving assembly line techniques that he really pioneered. As the assembly line moves, the worker stays in one place and just does one specific low-skilled job, like adding tires or adding a steering wheel, what have you. In doing this, his plant in Detroit can produce a car every 10 seconds. This lowers the cost of production, therefore lowering the overall cost of the vehicle. He could sell his Model Ts in the mid-20s for $260 each, and obviously we've seen lots of inflation since then, but $260 was well within the middle-class consumer's price range, and because of this, he sold 20 million cars by 1930. Model Ts everywhere on the streets, and they could be in any color that you want as long as it's black. All right, the automobile effects on the economy. Oh, talked about this already, employing 6 million people, highway construction, gas stations, laying road, etc. We also see oil becoming a huge, huge business and industry as the automobile starts to flourish. And we start to see oil derricks popping up, oil in general becoming a big industry, California, Texas, Oklahoma. We see that the United States becomes the leading producer of oil in this early era, all the way through World War II, and then all of a sudden becomes a net importer of oil as we become dangerously dependent on foreign oil, especially. Airplanes come in at literally the same time as automobiles, and we often think that the automobile would come first because it seems like it's a much lower ability of technology, much less technology to make a car go than to make a plane go. But in fact, they're coming in really at the exact same time, the Wright brothers are flying in North Carolina, the Miracle at Kitty Hawk in 1903. And so we start to see the air industry start to come into its own in the 1920s. In the World War One, planes were really just used for reconnaissance to scout out the enemy's trenches. But of course, in World War Two, it is the most important part of warfare. And so, in those 20 years, airplanes really have developed a lot. At first used for transportation, especially for mail. The first transcontinental air mail route was established in 1920. But then we start to see passenger planes become more and more prevalent, especially after one hero American, Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh, flies nonstop across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. This kind of validates the technology of airplanes in a big way, and it popularizes flying, which makes aviation a huge industry. And by 1930s and 1940s, it was actually safer to fly than it was to drive a car, and it becomes a staple in the American economy. It's going to be another setback to the railroad industry, and of course, it is weaponized in World War II. The radio, another thing in the 1920s, and when we look at the 1920s, very similar to the 1950s for many reasons. The U.S. emerges out of a world war with lots of money and prosperity, and we see lots of wealth, conservative politics. All of these things are similar between the 1920s and the 1950s. And the other thing that is similar is we have some sort of medium of mass media. In the 1920s, it's the radio, of course. In the 1950s, it's television. And the radio is absolutely mass media in the 1920s and adds to a mass consumer culture of advertising and consumerism. A Pittsburgh radio broadcast in 1920 is going to broadcast the news of Harding winning the election. And then national networks develop the technology to broadcast across the country. And this is going to bring the country together because now Americans, no matter where you're living, are hearing the same advertisements. You start to hear these brand names emerge. And we see commercials become $1 million industry advertising for their respective products. And the radio is going to have a lot of effects on American society and culture. For one, it brings the family together as families gather around the railroad, listening to their favorite shows. We also see sports and music start to skyrocket in this time because it's broadcasted along the sound waves, of course. And then politicians now are going to start to become a little bit more general than they were before because they have to speak to the whole country. Previously, they would come in and they would have their speakings in different cities. And they would speak to that city, and their speech might be very different as they come to the next city or the next state. Now that their speeches are being broadcast throughout the country, it becomes a lot more general in their message to the public. Movies, especially at the end of the 1920s, become the most important form of amusement and entertainment in the country. Hollywood movies, the first sequence movie, The Great Train Robbery, it's about 14 minutes in 1903. But movies really come into their own in World War I as an element of propaganda against the Germans, especially the Hang the Kaiser movies. And then our first movie was Sound, The Jazz Singer, which are our first successful quote-unquote talkie. And what are our effects of Hollywood movies? Hollywood becomes the movie capital of the world. Again, it's the most popular form of amusement, and we start to see the birth of our movie stars as we see some of our movie stars like Charlie Chaplin, etc., become more popular than even the politicians of the world, the presidents of the country, etc. Women, this is a huge time of change for women, guys. The 1920s is a huge accelerated political and social change for women, obviously the catalyst of which being the 19th Amendment in 1920. More women are coming in and joining the workforce. Many of them still are restricted to jobs like retail and office typing, which becomes called women's work. Margaret Sanger is going to lead the birth control movement, which is part of this sexual revolution that occurs in the 1920s, where the changing relationships between singles is very apparent. Previously, a kiss was the equivalent of a marriage proposal. And now we have the women going out and drinking with the men out in the jazz clubs. And this is obviously a big change socially in this time period. Alice Paul with the National Women's Party also is going to start campaigning for the Equal Rights Amendment. This is the first time of two times that an Equal Rights Amendment is proposed to be added to the Constitution. Both of the times it's going to fail. The other time it comes in the late 60s and 70s. But it is not yet adapted to the Constitution. Aforementioned, the sexual revolution of the 1920s, advertisements especially start to use sexual allure as a way to sell their products. And this is especially characterized with our flapper girls, which of course have been a mainstay when thinking about the 1920s, with the dresses with the bobbed hair up at the top, and dresses above the knee, gasp. This is shocking elders. We have young people drinking and dancing and kissing in jazz clubs. So a big change, obviously, from the traditional ways of the country. Also, a huge cultural uprising in the 1920s with the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance, both of these two entrenched together. We see that during World War I, we had a great migration of blacks. We have African Americans moving north, especially to find jobs that were vacated by people that were drafted out of the northern cities to go off and fight in World War I. Because of this, we have this movement north of African Americans to find jobs in the cities. And so we see our first great movement of African Americans north. And with this, they're going to bring their culture with them, especially their music. Coming in from New Orleans, this is where jazz comes in, is settling in some of the sections of the northern cities. One such section is Harlem, becomes one of the largest black communities in the world. And this is where we see the emergence of black culture in a big way. And it becomes a national stage. Jazz artists like W.C. Handy, playing the St. Louis Blues. We also see black poets like Langston Hughes, other jazz artists, Louis Armstrong, like all of these artists in any way, shape, or form that are becoming so popular with the country. This is the national emergence of black culture, and that's what the Harlem Renaissance was all about, in which the rest of the country, especially whites, came to look at, respect, admire, and attempt to duplicate black music, black culture, etc. Okay, one part of this, a political part of the Harlem Renaissance, was Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica, and he at first comes in with an organization meant to actually take African Americans out of the United States and take them back to Africa, a resettlement organization. Yet before this occurred, part of what his organization was meant to do was to collect membership dues and then to use these dues to give back to the hands of all black businesses to keep black businesses going throughout the country. This was one of the big political organizations to come out of the Harlem Renaissance, which is another emergence of black culture throughout this time period out of Harlem. Okay, and then we start kind of getting into the Great Depression here, because we start talking about some of the big causes of the Great Depression. And the 1920s, as I mentioned, was a time of great luxury, especially for the middle class and the upper classes. But there were some very, very shaky grounds in which this prosperity rested upon. Many Americans are living on credit. They're buying on credit. They're spending throughout their means. They're also spending lots in the stock market, investing. Many Americans believe that this prosperity of the 1920s will not end, and so they are frantically buying stock in anything that they can, which becomes, of course, very, very dangerous if there would be a downturn in the economy. We also, as we always see with with crashes, with depressions or panics, land speculation being a part of this. And this is where land is overvalued and people come in and spend lots of money on land thinking that they'll be able to make that money back having bought this land, and then pay back the bank. And then, of course, they've overvalued how much the land actually was worth and they can't pay back their profits. This is especially true of Florida in this time period where advertisers are advertising a nice soft Caribbean wind when in fact they're selling lands that are hard hit by hurricanes. And so, of course, that is a factor in this. But the long-term factor, or one of the long-term factors of the Great Depression, is the tax policies in the 1920s by our very conservative politicians of the 1920s. We have Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon suggests that if we have high taxes, especially on the rich, this is stopping the rich from buying and building more factories and investing in the American economy. Therefore, he says that we need to lower taxes, especially on the richest Americans, so that they can afford to continue to build more and more factories. And he, of course, would then be a believer in trickle-down economics, that if the rich are doing well, they're going to employ more workers and the economy will do well. And so because of this, he's going to engineer a series of tax reductions in which much less taxes are being taken from the upper 10%. Now, in doing this, this is going to create a serious problem in the 1920s. In this era of consumerism, where people are buying as many consumer products as they can, as I mentioned, obviously the automobiles and the vacuum cleaners and the refrigerators and all these things. Well, consumers are going to, most of the country are in the top 10%. Our consumers are going to be the other 90% that need to buy all of these products. And what we'll see is with all of the rich not paying as many taxes, they're buying more and more factories. They're investing in, so we have this huge overproduction of goods, and yet we don't have the middle classes. More and more, the middle classes can't afford these goods. And so because of this, we start to see Americans going into debt and overproduction becoming a massive problem. And we can also tie the Depression to some very laissez-faire economics of the 1920s. We have 3 presidents in the 1920s, all of which are Republicans and all of which believe in keeping their hands off of the economy and letting the economy to run itself. So we are essentially moving far away from the progressive era. Our 3 progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, all of which believed in heavy regulation of the economy or laws to regulate trusts or break up trusts. Our 3 Republican presidents of the 1920s are not at all of that same mindset. They believe that they should help guide business to profit and not break up trusts. And because of this, we see again the wealth congregate in the top 10% of the country. Harding is not a strong American president. He's going to have a tremendous amount of problems. First of all, he's going to make in forming his cabinet, he's going to make 2 grave errors. The first is when he hires Albert Fall to be the Secretary of Interior. Albert Fall is a oil mogul, and so that's essentially like hiring a wolf to defend the sheep. Harry Dougherty is our Attorney General. He's a small town lawyer and a crook. He is going to be caught in some bribes and selling illegal liquor pardons. He's going to be convicted and resign. We see some major scandals in the Harding administration, the biggest of which will be the Teapot Dome scandal. The other thing that Harding is going to do is going to appoint 4 very conservative justices. And then when the 1930s come around and the New Deal, which is a very liberal time, these justices will remain and be a thorn in the side of FDR as he tries to make some changes to help people in the Great Depression. Okay, with this conservative era, we see some reverses of progressive reforms. Adkins v. Children's Hospital is a reverse of Muller v. Oregon. Mueller v. Oregon was protection for women in the workplace. The decision by the Supreme Court in Adkins v. Children's Hospital was, since women now are political equals to men with the 19th Amendment, they therefore shouldn't be protected by special legislation. So we do see a shift in progressive, a loss for workers here. And then down at the bottom, corporations are allowed to expand, antitrust laws not enforced. That should be in the hands of the Attorney General, but Albert Fall isn't doing anything. They're allowing businesses to expand, which of course is going to lead to problems in the Great Depression. Union membership is going to decrease by 30% in the 1920s as they don't have support from the federal government, and obviously because of the Red Scare and strikers being labeled as socialists or communists, what have you. And again, Dougherty is going to fight strikes with injunctions and no help from the federal government. The one worker group that is successfully get help from the federal government is veterans. One interest group, a lobby group, American Legion, is going to lobby for veterans benefits. We're talking about veterans of World War I, and they are going to succeed in getting a bonus. They are going to get money back. Their argument was that because we served and fought for the country in World War I, we missed out on some of the best and most profitable years in American history, and therefore we should be given some sort of compensation for this. And so the bonus bill is projected is a possibility of passing, but Harding is going to veto this. And then the Adjusted Compensation Act is going to be proposed. Then Coolidge is going to attempt to veto it, but Congress overrides his veto. And so veterans are going to be owed $3.5 billion in total, but it's due in 20 years. Okay, so we can do the simple math here. Here it is in 1924. So this $3.5 billion is due in 1944 for our veterans of World War I. Now, there's something that's going to happen before 1944 that's going to want those veterans to want that money immediately, and that, of course, is the Great Depression. So the Adjusted Compensation Act, our bonus for veterans, is one to keep an eye on in the Great Depression. All right, dealing with World War I. So there's a couple of loose ends after World War I, one of which is the fact that the United States very conspicuously did not sign the Treaty of Versailles. So technically, we're still at war with Germany. In 1921, Congress is just going to pass a joint resolution and just say the war is over. Very unceremoniously, not even talking to Germany about it, just saying the war is over. Then Harding is going to send unofficial observers to the League of Nations. Nope, we're not part of the League of Nations. We're just observing what's going on there. Kind of a weird scenario over there. And then we have something that epitomizes the 1920s and the 1930s, which is disarmament in isolation. Isolation, guys, we have to remember is viewed, disarmament and isolation are viewed very much the same thing. When you look at the causes of World War I, the main causes, MAIN, of course, militarism was one of those first things, having these large armies, building up weapons of war, which causes other countries to do the same and form alliances and all these things. And so disarmament was viewed as something that's going to prevent future wars. We don't need to have these big weapons of war. And that's what the Washington Disarmament Conference was about, caught in the isolationist attitude of the 1920s. Secretary Charles Evan Hughes is going to propose a 5-5-3 ratio between the three great navies of the world at this stage, the US, Britain, and Japan. The US had been largely catching up to Britain as having the strongest navy in the world. And Japan, very much the same way, had been producing military ships out in the Pacific. They had been engaging in imperialist wars now for 20 years. They defeated the Chinese. And so Japan had become a superpower in its own. What has happened here is that in this Washington Disarmament Conference, Japan is slighted in a big way, especially because of overt racism here. We see this ratio proposed of how much tonnage of naval ships that each country should be allowed to have. When we see 5-5-3, that means 500,000 tons. The US is allowed 500,000 tons. Britain is allowed 500,000 tons. Japan only 300,000 tons. This is conference here that is obviously and intentionally limiting the military power of Japan. Britain and the United States therefore have to make some concessions to Japan, and so they agree that we are not going to fortify any of our possessions over in the Pacific in the East. Britain has Malaya, Burma, these rubber producing colonies out in Southeast Asia. Of course, the United States has the Philippines and Guam. In the agreeing not to fortify these places, it makes it easier for the Japanese to conquer these once World War II breaks out. Whew, okay, so we're in our 1920s. With 1920s, we have conservative politics. With conservative politics, we see bigger tariffs. Wilson was our last president. His second term is over in 1921. So therefore, here comes Harding, and Harding is going to raise the tariff. The 40 McCumber tariff signs off on this. We see a 12% increase from Wilson's Underwood tariff, and this is going to allow the president to raise or reduce duties. They're not going to be doing a lot of reducing. They're going to be raising, very characteristic of the Republican Party, especially in the 1920s. You can see the American tariffs raising very slightly initially, and then boom, in 1930, that will be our Hawley-Smoot tariff. Okay, when we raise our tariffs, that's going to start a little bit of global economic nationalism. What that means is, especially Europe, after World War I was in shambles. Their economies were weak, their manufacturing factories destroyed, and because they weren't really able to conduct business as usual, as so many people were fighting in the war, they had this surplus of manufactured goods that they really wanted to sell. And so many manufacturers thought, well, we'll cut our costs and we'll try to sell at very low rates. Now, in doing so, American manufacturers called the Congress, protect our industries, let's raise taxes, let's raise the tariff. And so because of this, we have this high tariff. The problem with this is Europe has no one to sell their goods to. This is going to put Europe even more into economic dire straits, especially poor Germany, who was hit so hard from the Treaty of Versailles. And because of this, European nations are going to put up their tariffs as well. And so we have this economic global nationalism where nobody is trading with anybody else. And when we have this era of mass production, that's going to create a problem in every economy and lead directly to the Great Depression. The Teapot Dome scandal is Harding's biggest scandal. His appointee, the Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, is going to do something quite dastardly. We have lands, nature reserves that have oil that are reserved for the Navy. These are lands that the Navy is going to need for oil to fuel their military ships, what have you. One is in Wyoming and one is in California. Albert Fall is going to convince the Secretary of the Navy to transfer these to his department, the Interior Department. He's the Secretary of Interior. And then once he does this, then he accepts bribes, one from Edward Doheny, another from Harry Sinclair. He's getting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, and he allows these oil investors to take oil that's supposed to be reserved for the Navy to be taken for themselves, to be sold for private use. This obviously is illegal. We have someone in the executive branch, the Secretary of Interior, taking bribes. This is a huge scandal, and the details are going to leak in March of 1923. And just as these details are getting out, Harding kind of gets sick and ill and dies of pneumonia. So Harding really doesn't even have to deal with this scandal, which is quite unfair in some ways, that their justice wasn't served. And in another way that justice wasn't served is that Albert Fall is found guilty for taking the bribe, but the bribe givers, the two people that gave the bribes, were acquitted because they had such great lawyers. And this is going to be a very frustrating thing for the American public. First of all, frustrating that we have someone in the executive branch that is accepting bribes, and then losing faith in our court system, because how are these people that bribed for their own personal use not being thrown in jail? And this is the saying goes that you don't see many millionaires in jail, and that's holds true here. So Calvin Coolidge becomes our next president after Harding. He was the vice president of Harding and thus follows in many of his same ideals as far as business. He also agrees with the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who once again talks about reducing taxes, especially for the rich. But Calvin Coolidge is a much different persona than Harding. Calvin Coolidge is a much more trustworthy person. He really is able to um, come across as honest and come across as someone who is trustworthy, and he kind of restores some faith to the presidency that Harding had lost, obviously. But Coolidge is really going to contribute to the Great Depression with his laissez-faire economic policies. Now, Coolidge is known as a very successful president because the stock market didn't crash under his watch. However, he's going to make his way all the way until 1928, where things get steadily more and more shaky, and then Hoover becomes our next president, and everything falls apart under Hoover. Now, during Coolidge's presidency, farmers are having trouble, and really they've had trouble since right after World War I, because they bought all of this land to be able to pay for, be able to produce more crops to hit that high demand as the war is going on. We have so many people fighting, we have less people farming. That means we have this high demand for crops. And so American farmers are buying as many machines as they can and as much land as they can to be able to produce all these crops and send them overseas. Well, of course, once the war ends, that demand for these crops drop. And now we see farmers suffering from massive overproduction, thus bringing down the prices for their goods. And so farmers are really going to start entering the Depression in the 1920s when the rest of the country is flourishing. Um, Internationally, the Europe has gone through some big problems after World War One. And the United States largely benefited from their problems because in 1914, the first year of World War One, the U.S. is $4 billion in debt. When we get into 1922, the U.S. is $16 billion in the positive, and they are loaning money to other countries, especially Britain and France. Now, these loans, the Allies hoped, Britain and France hoped that they could be written off because of how much they suffered in the war and how much they spent in manpower, physical loss of life, to stop the Germans from winning the war. Calvin Coolidge is going to say, "You hired the money, you're going to pay us back." And his insistence on Britain and France paying back the United States after World War One is going to be an indirect contributor to the Nazi Party coming to power in Germany, because with the insistence that Britain and France pay back their loans, Britain and France are going to turn to Germany and ask for more and more reparations. The situation in Germany becomes so dire with hyperinflation, etc., that they turn to a lunatic, a maniac, an Adolf Hitler of the Nazi Party. All of this is really kind of showed with leading up to the Dawes Plan. So the U.S. is insisting on the Allies paying their debts. The French and the British are demanding Germany pay back their $32 billion in reparations. So Germany is going through hyperinflation. The Dawes Plan is an attempt to help out Germany in this situation. And so what's going to happen is U.S. bankers are going to start loaning money to Germany. Germany is going to pay that money back to England and France. England and France is going to pay that money back to the United States. So why then is the U.S. giving money to Germany that's just going to be paid back to themselves? Well, the thought process was, we're going to have these low interest loans to Germany. Eventually, Germany is going to have to pay back that money with interest. So it was an investment. But of course, the U.S. never does get its money. And this is going to create some much frustration in the United States with our politicians especially. And the frustration here is, we loaned the money, we gave you weapons, and we never got that money back. And so when we see the rise of fascism in Europe in about 10 years from now, in the 1930s, we're going to see the French and the English once again needing money, once again needing munitions, and the United States is going to say, too bad. we loaned you money before, we loaned you weapons before, and you didn't pay us back. And so in 1935, 1936, 1937, when the United States really could be loaning money and weapons to countries in Europe to resist fascism, do not do so. And as a result, the Nazi Party especially is able to use the mobilized German army to sweep through Europe in a big way. Um, the biggest tariff in the nation's peacetime history is the Hawley Smoot Tariff, 1930. This is Hoover, and this is an attempt to help the American economy that is already starting to stagger after the fall of the stock market. And this is going to only contribute to the Great Depression because there is no international trade that ensues after this Hawley Smoot tariff. It's a massive, massive tariff. Now let's talk about the Great Crash. Let's talk about that stock market crash, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. First of all, Britain already, with banks closing, are going to attempt to raise their interest rates, which means that for investors in Britain who had borrowed money from the bank to invest in American businesses that are doing so well, now interest rates are up, meaning they have to pay more money back to those banks for borrowing money from those banks. So British investors are going to stop investing in the American stock market. They're going to pull out. That's going to be a sizable detraction from the American stock market. Now we see Americans panic. They start selling their stock. We see a selling spree, and as a result, stockholders are going to lose $40 billion in 2 months. This is going to have drastic effects on the American economy. And the big reason why is because the stock market itself going down isn't going to be the end of the world. But with the stock market crash, we see all of these Americans that had borrowed money from the banks to invest in credit. What you call buying on margin. They bought stocks on margin, looking to make a quick sum of money, and then they were going to pay back the bank. Well, of course, the stock market crashes. They lose that money, and because they borrowed from the bank, now the banks are collapsing. And that's where the real problem is, because once the bank collapsed, people that weren't even invested in the stock market just lost all their money, as not yet are banks insuring private checking and savings accounts. So with this, we see much of the country not even invested in the stock market lose all of their money and wealth and savings. With all of this lack of money, people aren't buying things. Businesses are closing. When businesses close, we see unemployment raise, which only adds to the problems. In 1930, there's 4 million unemployed. 2 years later, 1932, that's the worst year of the Great Depression. We see 12 million unemployed. That is about a fourth of the country. Banks collapse. Thousands lose their homes and their farms. This, of course, is the Great Depression. What were our major causes? The number one cause is overproduction of farmers, overproduction of factories. We have too many goods being made and not enough people to buy those goods, especially after these huge tariffs. We don't see other countries coming in and buying goods from American producers. Also, with our poor distribution of wealth, we don't have enough American middle class of being able to afford these consumer products, as taxes have been lowered on the rich. The rich buy more and more factories, and yet that just provides more goods, not more wages for the middle class, for the workers. Obviously, credit down at the bottom, also a factor of the Great Depression. And so everything falls on Hoover, who was elected in 1928. Hoover, however, if you recall his work with the Food Administration in World War I, is not a believer in federal mandates. He believes that the federal government doesn't need to come in and save the American people from the Depression, that Americans are tough. They have this rugged individualism about them. When goings get tough, they're going to work hard and get themselves out of this situation. And if the federal government did come in and give dole payments to the people, meaning direct sums of money, very much like, for instance, these checks that are coming in the mail right now, right? Those are dole payments. Those are money coming from the federal government to the people, right? And that is what FDR is believed in and what he did with these stimulus checks. Hoover is against this. He said, don't just give money directly to the American people. Let's help them. They should figure it out themselves, because if you give a dole to people, it kills their will to work. This is Hoover's ideology, but he is going to meet heavy criticism for this because it's an unprecedented time of suffering. And so people are going to be very, very frustrated at Hoover. They're going to call it the Hoover Depression. They're going to call these shanty towns that are emerging of unemployed and people that are homeless. They're going to call these Hoovervilles. I mean, it gets really, really bad. And so Hoover then finally says we need to do something. Begrudgingly, he says, I'll use federal power to fight the Depression. But he, so much like the other presidents, the conservative presidents of the 1920s, believes in trickle-down economics. And so he is going to assist the big businesses first, in hoping that this will trickle down to the masses. And so the best example of this is by establishing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is giving loans to the banks, the railroads, and the agricultural organizations, hoping this will flow down to the rest of the people. And he's only more resented for this. And then adding to his resentment is our veterans. And our veterans, of course, because of that Adjusted Compensation Act in 1924, are promised $3.5 billion in money to be given to them in 1944. Actually, really, not January 1st of 1945. Now the Depression is hit, and so our veterans want their money now. They want their bonus now, and so 20,000 veterans are going to march on Washington. This is the so-called bonus army. They are going to stay outside of the White House and wait until something happens. This is a long protest. Hoover, to his credit, tries to handle this very peacefully. He announces that unfortunately there is nothing that can be done, but he will pay for everyone's route back home, whether it be on a train or what have you. And so he's going to offer to pay passage back home. Some people leave, some people stay. Finally, because it's so politically damaging for Hoover, that he is going to accept a proposal by, at the time, General MacArthur to come in and clear out the rioters. MacArthur, much too heavy-handed in this, uses federal troops, bayonets, tear gas. A young child allegedly dies in this, and Hoover looks like an absolute villain in this whole scandal because he has come in and dispatched these protesters violently. He's not helping the Depression. Now he's attacking the nation's veterans, and Hoover has absolutely no chance for re-election in 1932. And of course, this is where this man comes in. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is got a plan to get the nation out of the Depression, repeal of prohibition. He blames Hoover for the Depression, although he knows it's not Hoover's fault, but of course he's a politician. One of the funny things of his platform initially in 1932, of course he's elected 4 times, but in this initial platform, promising to balance the budget and social and economic form. The balanced budget now is very laughable, considering that up until this point, no president spends like President FDR. The New Deal for the Forgotten Man is his promise. And that slogan, the Forgotten Man, is going to bring in new voters into the Democratic Party that had previously voted Republican. The Forgotten Man is identified by many of the new immigrants that are now looking to the Democratic Party as they are the forgotten men. They want a voice. And then most conspicuously, African Americans who have voted Republican faithfully since the 15th Amendment, since they've been able to vote, as the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. FDR is the president that makes this huge shift as African Americans begin to vote Democrat. And this becomes the modern Democratic Party. The New Deal Coalition, this is called, and it's a coalition of voters that give FDR incredible political power, and thus obviously elected 4 times. In his election in 1932 against Hoover, as you can see, it's not even close. 472 to 59 in favor of FDR, the big shift, African Americans to the Democratic Party. Okay, FDR is going to come in. We're going to make some big changes right away. We're going to see some direct government intervention in a way that we have not seen, and an extension of what we saw in the progressive era. The 100 Days is FDR working with a heavily Democratic Congress to pass seemingly an endless amount of laws to come in and try and combat the Depression. These laws are going to focus on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief immediately for people that need it the most, things like dole payments, direct payments; recovery to help unemployed, to get more jobs created; and reform to prevent future depressions down the road. FDR is given blank check powers in this time period, meaning he is able to come in and work with Congress to pass laws very quickly. And some of these laws give express powers to the president that we haven't seen before. The president able to regulate the economy and make some changes in the economy that constitutionally isn't given to the executive branch. His first move is banking relief, and this makes a tremendous amount of sense because Americans have no faith in the banks in the 1930s because all of the bank failures throughout the country. And this is creating huge problems in recovering the economy because there's no one to borrow money from. You can't buy a house, which is so important in the economy, or buy a car. Consumers are not there because it is difficult to get your hands on wealth or money. And so FDR knows that the banks have to be a top priority. The first thing he does is close all of the banks from March 6th to March 10th. He establishes the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which means the president can come in, investigate banks, look into banks, reopen banks, and then he takes to the radio. And he gives his first of many fireside chats in which he talks to the American people. FDR has a beautiful voice, the voice of a male angel, and he's going to come in and he's going to speak to Americans and tell them that it is now safe to reinvest their money back into the banks. It is much safer than putting it under the mattress. The banks are going to invest your money safely. You're going to accrue interest in your investments. Please put your money back in the banks. And in order to encourage them to do so, he introduces the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which is going to federally insure deposits into these banks. That if the bank fails, the federal government will get you your money. And so this is going to restore the faith in the banks and bring the nation's banking system back to where it should be. FDR is also going to try to play around with the gold standard. First of all, the country is losing lots of wealth in the Depression. They're losing lots of gold. And he's worried that the paper currency is just not going to really be worth anything with no gold in the nation's vaults. And so step one of his managed currency system was ordering citizens to return their gold to the treasury to be exchanged for paper currency. So people are going to come in, they're going to give gold to the treasury, they're going to be given paper currency back. And then FDR is going to take the nation off of the gold standard, and he's going to say, okay, continue to buy gold from citizens, and we're going to pay them back with inflated prices, meaning we're going to give them a whole bunch of paper currency back. What he's doing is promoting inflation. He wants inflation in paper currency because he wants people in debt to be able to pay back their debts with inflated bills. This is very much what the West has been calling for since the Gilded Age in paying back debts with inflated prices. He does return the nation to the gold standard in 1934. Recovery for unemployed. Okay, So we see in 1932, when FDR takes office, a fourth of the country unemployed. FDR says we need to prime the pump by using federal money to get some people jobs. And so FDR starts using federal money to create bureaucracies to hire unemployed. There's many examples of this. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, is one of them. We've got 3 million federal jobs for young men ages 18 to 25. You're going to go in and reforest the areas that have too many trees chopped down. You're going to go in and plant trees. You're going to drain swamps, work on irrigation, etc. Especially out in the Great Plains region, where we now are seeing, above all these other things, the Dust Bowl that are starting to emerge. And so this was a way to use federal money, creating jobs for young men, and then they had to send the majority of their paycheck back to their parents. That was what was so popular about the CCC. One of many ways, recovery for the unemployed. Direct relief. This is money straight into people's pockets. Federal Emergency Relief Act. That's $3 billion to the states for dole payments or wages for work projects. So again, this is the federal government saying, here, California, take 1 million, 5 million, $10 million, distribute this to your citizens. Those are dole payments, right? These are like our stimulus checks coming in the mail. These are helping people that are hit by the Depression. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is giving loans to farmers. And then our Civil Works Administration, think of cold winter. These are creating jobs during the winter time, some of them like leaf raking. Obviously, some of these laws are going to be criticized as make work projects, especially by richer Americans that are saying, why are our hard earned tax dollars, the money that we're paying taxes for, going to create jobs for the unemployed for leaf raking? And so he's going to have his critics. He's especially going to have his conservative critics, his fiscally conservative critics. And some critics, for instance, are these demagogues like Father Charles Coughlin, who's a Catholic priest from Michigan. He at first was on the same side as FDR. He said, this is the only man that can save us from the Great Depression. But then when FDR starts to distance himself from Coughlin, especially because of Coughlin's anti-Semitic views, Coughlin turns against him, starts speaking out against FDR. Huey Long, with his Share Our Wealth program. This was a very socialist program in which every country was supposed to receive $5,000 at the expense of the wealthy. This was, obviously very, very socialist. Huey Long is eventually assassinated. And then Dr. Francis Townsend, who's an older man, he was a physician. He lost it all in the Depression. And he is arguing that we need to have Americans that are now too old to work should be getting money on the behalf of the federal government. All of these people outspoken against FDR and epitomized different arguments against him. Some said that he wasn't socialist enough. Some said that he was too socialist. So he had his critics. Obviously, he had his critics. And some of these things didn't work. Some of these organizations didn't work, but some of them did. And they provided those Band-Aids during the Great Depression that kept Americans afloat until World War II gets us out of the Great Depression. So the Works Progress Administration, another one of those bureaucracies created during the New Deal that was employing unemployed Americans to build bridges and roads. And it is going to help build infrastructure in the United States and give Americans jobs. Over 9 million jobs created in 9 years. So obviously that's a positive for some. And then a very important one, the National Recovery Administration. This was one of the most controversial laws passed during the New Deal. When you think of NRA, no, not National Rifle Association. This is the National Recovery Administration. So this is the federal government getting involved in the economy in a way that certainly the framers would have been skeptical about. This was these fair competition codes. This is the federal government telling businesses that they have to follow these certain codes. And these codes involved putting a max number of hours that somebody could work. So if you're working in a job in a factory, for instance, and you were working 50 hours a week, now these new codes are going to say now you can only work 30 hours a week. You have to work less, right? Wow. So why then would this be a good thing? Well, the thought process was by making these businesses make so that their ceilings on how much somebody could work, you could now hire more people to come and take up those hours. So a distribution of wealth that way. They also established minimum wage so that you tried to raise the amount of money that each of these people were paid. So um, a way in which to employ more people and try to make up for the losses by establishing a minimum wage. The problem with this is going to be that there's nowhere in the Constitution that says the federal government can come in and do this, and the NRA is eventually found to be illegal because it is asking far too much of business, and in fact, businesses start to not follow these NRA laws because it is too much of a sacrifice that they have to do. One of the things the NRA also did was try and protect labor, and FDR is definitely going to try and protect labor in his New Deal laws. Um, Labor guaranteed the right to organize. They can bargain through a rep of their own choosing. Yellow dog contracts are forbidden. Yellow dog contracts mean anti-labor contracts, etc. The Public Works Administration, another make work organization, $4 billion to build new projects, public buildings, highways, parkways, and again, another federal bureaucracy here. Okay, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, this is another one that's eventually found to be unconstitutional because this one, once again, is too much federal control over the economy here. So we have farmers suffering. We have farmers that are overproducing and therefore are losing their farms. They're incredibly poor. And the biggest problem is just overproduction. We have too much crops, and therefore the price has dropped. What the Agricultural Adjustment Administration did was try to establish artificial scarcity. We don't have scarcity. We have overproduction. We're going to create artificial scarcity. And how are we going to do that? We're going to pay farmers not to farm. That is what this was. It was saying, farmers, you have 50 acres of land. We want you to only cultivate 30 of those acres. And then you are going to sell those crops for around the price that they were before World War One. Now, what the effect is that it is going to raise farm income, but now the peoples that were working on the farms that were cultivating those extra acres are now fired because they no longer have a job. You're not cultivating all 50 acres, you're only cultivating 30. And so it is going to raise unemployment. It's also really not any of the federal government's business to be able to come in and tell farmers what they can farm and what they can't. And so the Supreme Court is going to come in and shut this one down, just like the NRA. Okay, the Dust Bowl, geez. 1930s are rough. And we've got this Great Plains region over here that is just hit really hard by an environmental phenomenon called the Dust Bowl. Situation is that these are our breadbasket states. These are our states producing high qualities of agriculture, especially wheat and corn. And more lands are deforested. You chop down all the trees and you make these huge plantation farms. Well, the problem is that the trees were important in blocking the winds to come in and stopping the winds from coming in and turning over the topsoil. And without these trees there, and then with continued over farming, we have these loose topsoils, especially with the new mechanized machines being used by farmers out west. And so all of the topsoil is swept away and up into the air and then moved throughout the state, coming in and covering people's homes, getting into everything. A child in Kansas allegedly was killed by the dust. And so not only is it dangerous in the air and getting into everything, but also all of your soil is gone and you no longer can farm there. Tens of thousands are going to flee. The Okies and Arkies, people from Oklahoma and Arkansas, are leaving, and many of them came to Southern California. My grandmother, Grandma Bernice, left South Dakota in this time and came to California for this very reason. Okay, a landmark law, the Indian Reorganization Act. This is our Indian New Deal. We had our Dawes Act that is forcing Native Americans to assimilate. The Indian New Deal says, nah, we're not going to do this. We are going to reverse this. And so this is going to encourage tribes to reorganize, form their own governments once again. And this is going to be an attempt to preserve Native American lands. This is a big one for Native Americans with the New Deal. Um, okay, more agencies created, the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is looking to regulate the stock trade and make sure that safe practices are being conducted. This is a federal agency that's walking over for corruption at Wall Street to try and prevent, obviously, another Black Tuesday stock market fall. The Tennessee Valley Authority. This is perhaps the most socialist aspect of the New Deal. We have one of the most poverty-stricken areas of the whole country in this Tennessee Valley that drains into Mississippi and Alabama and the northern part of Georgia. We have lots of people that are living there in poverty with very little access to electricity. And their power providers there, private companies, are charging a tremendous amount of money for these people, and these people can't afford it. And so FDR and the Democratic Congress sees an opportunity here. Says, what if we hired a bunch of people to come in and irrigate the Tennessee River and then use it to produce hydroelectric power to be able to produce cheap electricity for all of these poverty-stricken people. This is going to be good for a number of levels. For one, it's going to put a bunch of people to work in irrigation, so we're going to give people jobs. For number two, we're going to reform this area. We're going to be able to change it and make it a more prosperous area. The problem, of course, is that this is a government-owned electricity business. And we have private electric businesses, private utilities businesses in the area that are saying, now we have to compete against the federal government in our industry. This is communism. This is the government controlling industry. And really, there's no argument to that. This is a state-controlled industry here competing against private businesses. Now, this is looked at as a necessary evil to provide jobs for people in the Tennessee Valley. This is dressed as an agency that is going to come in to try and discover how much money it would take or how a fair price would be to provide electricity for the people there. Of course, our utility corporations are going to lash back, but the Great Depression needs outweighed the protests of the utility corporations, and there were some positive outcomes out of this. Full employment in the region, cheap electric power, and the area transforms from one of the poorest areas in the country to one of the most flourishing regions of the United States. Also, one of the longest lasting impacts of the Great Depression was the Federal Housing Administration giving small loans to people looking to buy a home. And so this is going to help stimulate the construction industry. This is still around today. When Mr. Hill eventually buys a home with his wife, he is going to look to the Federal Housing Administration to help him out. And then the other very long-lasting element of the New Deal is the Social Security Act of 1935. This is to look to help people that are now too old to work to try and help them in future depressions, because it is going to give money, federal money, to people that have retired. This is certainly more socialistic than anything the country had seen from this point, more socialist than anything. But it was a very, very popular implementation, a new law, because it is helping the people that need it the most in the Depression. Wagner Act. This is for labor. We have two laws that are going to come in and help labor in a big way. Labor had been really hurting in the 1920s. Here we are in the 1930s. The New Deal, the Wagner Act, it's going to create the National Labor Relations Board. It's going to protect labor's right to organize and protect them in their collective bargaining. And then the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is going to forbid labor by children under 16 and protect industries workers in industries by establishing a minimum wage. Okay. In 1936, this is really the height of FDR's popularity. As you can see from the Electoral College map, um, nobody shoots at Santa Claus is the best way to put this. And FDR is coming in and handing out federal money like candy, and no one's going to disagree with that. We see the entire country, with the exception of Maine and Vermont, voting for FDR in this one. This is his second term, but in his second term, he gets into a little bit of problems. He is finding that some of his New Deal laws are being shot down, such as the NRA, such as the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And he's getting frustrated because the Supreme Court seems to be a thorn in his side, where obviously the country supports what he's doing. I mean, look at that. Country supports him, and yet the Supreme Court is shutting down what he's doing. And he's frustrated with this because obviously he didn't pick many of these Supreme Court justices. 6 out of the 9 are over 70 and are just hanging on, in their own words, to fight the creeping socialism that has emerged in the 1930s. And so FDR comes up with a plan, and he proposes this scheme, and he says that the president should be permitted to add a new Supreme Court justice for every member over 30 that would not retire. Now, the problem with this is that, yes, he was a very popular president, but Americans hold the Constitution as something higher than any president. And the Constitution guarantees checks and balances. And this is the president clearly trying to overstep one of the major checks on the president's power. This is going to lose FDR a tremendous amount of popularity because he is viewed as a tyrant, or a dictator in this case, as this political cartoon denotes. And the court packing scheme, again, is going to hurt his popularity. But the Supreme Court is going to be threatened by this and start to listen a little bit more to the mandates to the public and what the public are saying. And because FDR serves 4 terms, the clock is going to unpack the court. FDR eventually appoints 9 judges in his 4 terms. So obviously that is an unpacking of the court. Okay, Keynesian economics. We see in his second term that FDR is going to turn to Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes is a British economist who says the only way to get you out of the Depression is to spend. You need to spend more money than you have, because if you are taxing Americans, that's less money in Americans' pockets. That's less money that Americans contribute to the economy. So you shouldn't be taxing Americans during a depression. At the same time, what you're doing to help the depression, to fight the depression, is creating jobs with federal money. So in other words, you need to lower taxes and spend more. Inherently, that means you are spending money that you don't have. And that's exactly what John Maynard Keynes is advocating for: planned deficit spending. Spend money that you don't have to fight the depression. What is that going to do? That's going to put the U.S. in a tremendous amount of debt, because that is the only way that FDR thinks that he can fight the depression. And so he turns to this in his second term. All right, the overall New Deal effects and criticisms. Certainly a major criticism is the doubling of the federal debt in a big way. And actually that should be billion there, 19.5 billion to 40 billion. So more than doubles the national debt. We're going to see conservatives obviously are going to be frustrated with the New Deal because it is certainly more socialist than anything we have seen up until this point, and that certainly the regulations on the economy is stifling parts of private enterprise. It is the opposite of laissez-faire capitalism. And obviously big criticism is that it didn't cure the Great Depression. Unemployment's still at 15%, which is very, very high. And another criticism is that it expanded the federal government far more than our framers of the Constitution had anticipated. That the checks and balance on the federal government is far more powerful than the states at this stage. But what about some defenses of the New Deal? The goal wasn't perhaps to cure the Depression, it was to give relief, in which it did. It especially provided relief during the worst years in 32 and 33. It also showed that the federal government cared about the American people and that was bound to help fight against it. As FDR said, no one's going to starve. And he meant that. And obviously, this is a different tone than Hoover took, and perhaps helped preserve democracy in a time where economic hardships were leading to overthrows throughout the world. Obviously, there are many examples of that in Germany, for instance. In 1933, FDR deserves a little bit of criticism because he had the opportunity to try and negotiate with other countries to solve economic hardships in a worldview, to work together with other countries, for instance, Britain in the London Economic Conference. Can we try to stabilize the values of everybody's currency? Can we try to lower tariffs so that we can trade together? That's not going to happen. FDR is going to decide, I'm not going to go to that London Economic Conference because he wants to promote inflation in the United States. He wants to devalue the United States currency. And so he's going to balk at stabilizing the value of nations' currencies. He's going to walk out of that London Economic Conference. And the biggest reason for that is, the biggest effect of that is that it's going to strengthen global economic nationalism. Countries aren't working together during the Great Depression, and that, of course, is going to be an every man for themselves attitude that's going to lead to the rise of fascism. However, FDR is the best president at negotiating with Latin America. His policy, let this nation be that of a good neighbor. And what he means by that is finally working with Latin America, who up until this point has viewed the United States as the colossus to the north. Look no further than FDR's distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt is the best example to this, of terrible relations with Latin America. FDR is going to denounce armed intervention. We are not going to send troops into Latin America anymore. He also is going to set up the 7th Pan-American Conference so that we can trade and work with Latin America, withdrew troops from Haiti, got Cuba out of that Platt Amendment. And then when Mexico nationalizes their oil, then largely controlled by American investors, he seeks arbitration and settles rather than sending in American troops. The result is that U.S. relations with Latin America better than ever. But this will, of course, only be temporary, as things will turn back to bad once again when we get to Eisenhower in the 50s. Okay, so now we get to these scumbags. The rise of totalitarianism, the 1930s. Of course, we've been talking all domestic situations with the New Deal, but of course, the other situation is the rise of totalitarianism overseas. Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and then Joseph Stalin, who's been in power since 1924. All of these men, mass murderers, all of these men, anti-democracy. And so they present a considerable threat in Europe that, of course, the whole world will have to deal with. And yet, as these dangerous dictators rise to power, American isolation tradition raises its ugly head, as well as resentment of non-payments after World War I. We see lots of feelings of isolationism because of the defaulting debtors, such as Britain and France. And our Johnson Debt Default Act says we are not going to loan any more money to nations that defaulted when were supposed to pay us back after World War I. Especially contributing to this is the Nye Committee. The Nye Committee was investigating why the U.S. entered World War I to begin with. They come out with evidence that the U.S., one of the major reasons why the U.S. entered the war was because American bankers and arms dealers had loaned so much money to Britain and France. While that was a reason, of course, that wasn't the biggest reason. The biggest reason were German submarines were sinking merchant ships that had Americans on them. But nonetheless, this is going to convince Americans that loaning money to other countries gets you into war. And therefore, we see lots of laws in the 1930s aimed to give no help to other countries, whether it be monetary or arms. And that, of course, spawns the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. All of them together say when the president notices or exclaims an existence of a foreign war, that immediately these things go into effect. No American can sail on a ship of a country that is at war, a belligerent ship. You cannot sell or transport munitions, meaning arms, weapons, to a belligerent, a warring nation, and you cannot make loans to a belligerent. And of course, these laws are going to doom France and almost doom Britain. Then the Spanish Civil War emerges, and FDR learns this the hard way because FDR calls this a war. Hey, Ali. We have a fascist dictator over here, Francisco Franco. Spain has formed a very temporary Republican government, a democratic government, and Francisco Franco is coming in to seize power back for totalitarianism. He is going to come in, and had he gotten help from the United States, perhaps been defeated. In fact, Hitler and Mussolini are going to provide weapons and arms to Francisco Franco. They're even going to bomb the northern city of Guernica in this war. And yet the United States, because FDR proclaimed this as a war, could not get involved. They embargoed both sides, meaning we're not going to trade with either side, and helped in the process condemn a fellow democracy to death. However, FDR doesn't make the same mistake with China. Japan launches a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. They had already invaded Manchuria in 1931. This is really the launch of the Second Sino-Japanese War, or the second war between China and Japan. And this time, FDR correctly does not call it a war. He calls it an incident. And because of this, he is able to supply the Chinese with much needed munitions to fight back against the Japanese, which was a great move by FDR, obviously. Of course, because he called it an incident, he can't be supporting only one side. Actually, the U.S. supplied, to a lesser extent, Japan munitions as well, lest they be accused of taking the side of China in this one. Okay, so this timeline moves very, very quickly. Nazi Germany, now under the control of Adolf Hitler, is going to move to acquire Lebensraum, as Hitler called it, living space to form this Third Reich German Empire. And so he is going to start violating laws left and right, both of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Germany had joined the League of Nations after World War I and then just drops out of it with no repercussions. Hitler is going to introduce compulsory military service. That means a draft. He starts drafting people into the army, which of course was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. He's going to march into the demilitarized Rhineland area, which was illegal pursuant to the Treaty of Versailles. He gets the country completely mobilized in a wartime economy, building tanks, building planes. Then in 1938, the Anschluss moves into Austria and absorbs Austria into Germany. Then he's going to start accusing Czechoslovakia of mistreating Germans, makes up a whole bunch of BS, and then is going to ask for the Sudetenland, this land over here in Czechoslovakia. The Czechs are going to say, no way. Hitler meets with the leaders of Britain and France in Munich. Neville Chamberlain actually shakes Hitler's hand and says, yes, you can take the Sudetenland as your last territorial demand. Hitler sweeps into the Sudetenland and then takes over the rest of Czechoslovakia a few months later. And then still Britain and France don't declare war on Germany. And it is only until September 1st that the invasion of Poland brings in World War II. But before this happens, Hitler ties up a loose end by allying with the Soviet Union, with the non-aggression pact, or the Nazi-Soviet pact, so that they will not attack each other after the invasion of Poland. Of course, Poland was created out of two countries after World War I. One of those countries was Germany. The other one was Russia. Both of these countries looked to regain the land that was taken from them to create Poland. And so both of these countries, Germany and Russia, invade Poland to start World War II. September 1st, 1939, that is the start of World War II. And so, of course, Americans are overwhelmingly anti-Nazi, anti-Hitler, but FDR is fighting against a militantly isolationist American people. The American people do not want to get involved in this European war. And so because of this, FDR has to issue a neutrality proclamation, although he does give a speech in Chicago called the Quarantine Speech in 1937, where he says we must quarantine the belligerent nations in the world. And he's met with heavy criticism for that. He's criticized for saying that the Nazis are dangerous and that they need to be dealt with, and that Imperial Japan is dangerous and need to be dealt with. And so Britain and France desperately need those American planes and weapons, and yet the Neutrality Acts forbid them. And so the one change that does occur after World War II commences is the cash and carry law, which says if you pay cash and you come and you get them yourselves, you can buy weapons from the United States. Now, this is going to be very short-lived because Britain and France are already in debt after World War I. They are still in debt. They're not going to be able to afford very many weapons. And of course, why do they have to come get it themselves? Because if American merchant ships have to deliver them, this could cause a repeat of World War I as far as merchant ships being sunk by German submarines. So the Neutrality Act of 1939, the first movement out of neutrality, but still, you got to pay cash, you got to pick it up yourself. Then Hitler is going to commence what they call the Rape of Scandinavia, move into northern Western Europe, conquering Denmark and Norway and the Netherlands. Then he blitzkriegs through Belgium, through the Ardennes forest and into France. And France just falls in a matter of weeks. And the fall of France is a major wake-up call to the United States, because France was the pillar, the stronghold of the Western Front in World War I, where it fought valiantly for 4 years against the Germans. And now with the fall of France, there is now a drastic need to come in and help Britain, which really the last remaining country that needs to be defended in this war. And so the United States wakes up and realizes that England needs to be protected. FDR asked Congress for billions in the defense of the United States. Congress responds, 1 year, $37 billion in amping up protection of the United States. Conscription, meaning the first peacetime draft in our country's history, preparing for combat, and the Havana Conference saying with Latin America, you need to share the responsibility of defending the Western Hemisphere. And of course, we need to help Britain. And so as the Battle of Britain rages in the airs above Britain, where London is bombed each and every night, Hitler eventually calls off the invasion of Britain because the Royal Air Force, using their new technology, radar, is able to defend against superior numbers of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. But there's concerns of starvation, because while there is no imminent raid of England, German submarines have surrounded their island and are not letting any foodstuffs in or out. The English then drastically need destroyers that are equipped with sonar that can find the U-boats below them and drop depth bombs to destroy them. But the British don't have any destroyers left, and so they Winston Churchill turns to FDR and says, can you supply us with destroyers? FDR knows that Congress won't allow it, and it is illegal. You're supposed to be paying cash pursuant to the Neutrality Act of 1939, cash and carry. And so FDR says, fine, I'll trade them to you. Brilliant move by FDR. He doesn't go through Congress. This is he and Churchill. He says, I'll give you 50 destroyers. You give me 8 bases in the Western Hemisphere. They trade this. This is obviously a non-neutral move, but FDR understands the importance of this. And this shows the turning of American isolationist sentiment, as most Americans actually supported this deal, despite the fact that this was a completely unilateral move made by FDR himself. Then comes Lend-Lease. Britain can't pay for things anymore. They're out of money. And if we're insisting they pay for cash, then that's never going to fly. And so Lend-Lease is pretty much an economic declaration of war on Germany, because now FDR says that this is a situation where your neighbor's house is on fire. You need to loan them a hose to help put out the fire. And so that is our Lend-Lease bill, where now you can come and borrow or lease as many weapons of war as you want, Great Britain. And what this really means is an endless supply of weapons and money going to Great Britain to fight against the Nazis. Obviously, this is a non-neutral move, but because Hitler can't conquer Britain now, he turns on his ally Stalin and invades Russia, looking for oil and resources. And FDR is going to loan money to Russia as well. Wow, the totalitarian communist state Russia. This is perfectly epitomizes how desperate and drastic things are in World War II, where we are helping communist Soviet Union in this one. But I think Winston Churchill says it best, where if Hitler invaded hell, that he'd be willing to work with the devil himself. And that is exactly what FDR is doing here, loaning money to Soviet Russia. And now the Soviet Union becomes a ally of convenience in World War II against the Nazis. The Atlantic Conference, meeting in secret on a warship outside of Canada, Churchill and FDR meet to discuss the threat of Japan and the war. They write an Atlantic charter, very Wilsonian in its views of post-war, after the war, self-determination of the countries that are liberated from the Nazis, etc. Clearly here, once again, another very unneutral act by these two countries. And here we are in August of 1941. So we are on the doorstep of the attack at Pearl Harbor. And speaking of the attack at Pearl Harbor, what is going on with the US and Japan? Japan is very, very dependent on Western resources: steel, iron, oil, and rubber. And the US starts to embargo these resources going to Japan. So now the Japanese military strategists understand that without these supplies of steel and iron and oil and rubber, they won't be able to produce weapons of war, and they won't be able to protect themselves if one of these countries were to come in and try to attack Japan. Japan has been bullied before by Western powers, and it's been insulted again and again by the United States, halting immigration, gentleman's agreement, trying to restrict Japanese citizenship or stopping them from owning land. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so the Washington Naval Conference, another example. And so the Japanese here are very resistant to giving up control of their military. And so we have two alternatives, right? The Japanese can either say, okay, we will leave China as you are asking us to do so that we can continue to receive Western oil and natural resources, or they can attack all of the lands in the Pacific that have all of these resources and acquire them for themselves. And that seems like a big ask, because we have some of the most powerful Western European countries and the United States in the Pacific. But if you look at it from the lens of 1941, you realize, in fact, that this is a much easier task than it may look. For instance, the British control Malaya down here, the biggest producing rubber colony in the world, but the British are hanging on by a thread against the Nazis over there in Great Britain. The French controlled Indochina here, but the French have already been defeated by the Nazis and split up into two sections of military occupation by the Nazis. The Netherlands control the Dutch East Indies down here, which are rich with oil, but the Netherlands have been conquered by the Nazis. And so the only state that is here, the only country that is here to protect itself against Japanese aggression, of course, is the United States, the one nation not in the war, and they are located in the Philippines and Guam. And of course, the Japanese know this, and so this sets up the attack at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. 183 torpedo bombers come in and attack Ford Island, the island of Oahu, and Pearl Harbor, and are looking to sink large American ships of war, particularly Battleship Row. This is a Sunday morning, and so many American military personnel are on the island. They are not at their posts, 2 waves of attacks is there to come in and sink as many of these ships as possible and inflict as many casualties as possible. 2,000, over 2,000 casualties in this one, and all of the American Western fleets damaged when it comes to battleships. Conveniently for the Japanese, 8 battleships moored side by side. This is Battleship Row. This was bore the brunt of the attack on December 7th, where we see all of these ships either heavily damaged or sunk. And the Japanese are making a huge gamble here that the Americans now, without these battleships, will not be able to challenge them in the Pacific. But they make a grave mistake in the fact that had this war occurred 5, certainly 10 years previous, that sinking these battleships would have been a devastating move. But war has changed, particularly naval war has changed to the point where the most important military unit by sea is now aircraft carriers, because of the abilities of aircraft now to be able to fight in the air, to dive bomb, to attack things on land. And so by targeting battleships and not aircraft carriers, the United States is not completely destroyed in the West, and they are going to rebound very, very quickly. And especially with the the manufacturing capacities of the United States is going to create a new Western Navy quicker than the Japanese ever could have imagined. And so, of course, we don't have any more isolationist sentiment after the attack at Pearl Harbor. Millions of Americans cry, "Get Japan first." FDR is not going to listen to that. He makes the single greatest international foreign policy decision by a president here, to say the bigger threat is the opposite direction in Europe. We need to go and save Britain first and deal with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Then we will come and deal with Japan. And that decision, despite millions of Americans crying to get Japan first, proves to be the decision that wins the war. FDR enters the ABC-1 agreement. That's America, Britain, and Canada. Canada is part of the British Commonwealth. Let us go get Germany first and assist Britain and the USSR before it's too late. And so the US is going to start a massive period of mobilization. But the big negative, both from this war in the US domestically and on FDR's resume, is Japanese internment. This is FDR's big, horrific mistake. There has been in our country a massive amount of anti-Japanese sentiment. And with this attack at Pearl Harbor now, a huge wave of racism, overt racism against the Japanese, to the point where the U.S. government is fearing that in some way Japanese people of Japanese descent in the country will aid a Japanese invasion of the United States. And so over 110,000 Japanese are herded into concentration camps. And when I say Japanese, let me be clear on this. These are people of Japanese descent, but the majority of them, the mass majority of them, are American citizens. 2/3 of them are born in the United States, born American citizens. Many more of them are naturalized American citizens. These are people that are being discriminated against because of their ancestry and that alone. And not only are they deprived of their dignity, of their basic rights, and forced into these camps that are largely on the Western coast, California, Nevada, Arizona, but also economically crippled for decades, because they are not able to make any money in these camps. They lose control of their houses, of their businesses. Their houses and businesses are looted by other Americans. And this is obviously one of the worst treatments of an origin of our country in our history. And the country at the time is going to defend this by the Supreme Court. Fred Korematsu is someone who resists being relocated to a camp. He says, I'm not going to go. I refuse. The Supreme Court is going to defend FDR's decision by executive order to allow Japanese internment. And so this is obviously another federal branch of the government making a mistake here by allowing internment of Japanese citizens. our country has since acknowledged that these were mistakes and given $20,000 to each family of someone who went to a camp. Of course, not enough, obviously. Um, all right, War Production Board. This existed in World War One, but was very, very weak. In World War Two, this is the most important federal agency in producing weapons of war. This is going to take direct control over the economy in major ways. The government says you will no longer produce automobiles; those are non-essential. Now you will produce tanks, you will produce planes. It institutes a national speed limit to preserve rubber on the tires. You are only allowed to buy this much gasoline a week. We need to save oil and gas for weapons. We are going to transform your business into a rubber plant. You are now going to produce bullets or aircrafts or ships or tanks. Every aspect of the economy regulated by the federal government. You will pay your workers this amount. You will produce this many planes. You will sell them only to the US government at this rate. Complete control of the economy instituted by the War Production Board. And in order to get people to follow suit with this, they have a series of other regulatory agencies and laws. With this new economy, we see immediate removal from the Great Depression. We see full employment, and now with many Americans with lots of money in their pockets, but because so many businesses have been transformed to war businesses, we now see a scarcity of consumer goods, a scarcity of goods that people were purchasing previously, refrigerators, cars, food, all of these things. And so with that, we see an inflation. We see inflation of those goods. And this is something that the government is concerned about. And so they create an agency called the Office of Price Administration that is going to try and combat inflation by intentionally creating rationing of critical goods. And so the federal government works to fight inflation. The War Labor Board is going to try and fight inflation by keeping money out of Americans' pockets, which is really interesting. They're going to impose ceilings on wage increases, meaning you cannot pay your workers more because we don't want your workers having all this money in their pockets and then the goods raising in price as a result. Labor, of course, is deeply going to resent this coming just out of the Great Depression. Okay. Who's serving? 15 million men are going to enlist in this war. This is the most amount of soldiers mobilized in a war in America's history and in world history. We also see an unprecedented amount of women serving in non-combat duties, but auxiliary combat duties. In a much bigger number, 6 million women are going to move into the factories. And in doing so, women take a huge place of men that deserted the factories to go to the battlefields. This was an incalculable amount of bonus to American manufacturing that nations like Japan and Germany did not take advantage of. American women saved the day in manufacturing. The Japanese did not utilize their women to the extent that the United States did, nor did Germany. So this is obviously huge. Women saved the day here. Rosie the Riveter, encouraging women to come in and do this. And many think that this is a huge change in American employment for women, and that's not the case, not yet. After the war, we see our baby boomer generation, and women, for the most part, are going to come back into the home, where we see our baby boomer generation, and we see a reemergence of the cult of domesticity, especially because of popular media and the white flight to the suburbs and all that stuff. Bracero program. How tides have turned now that we are at war, because now we have all the fighting going on. We have an increased demand for food because of all of these people overseas that used to be farmers. Now they're fighting, and so because of this, we need more workers to work agriculturally. The Bracero program was an agreement with the Mexican government that brings in lots of Mexican agricultural workers. And this is actually going to last 20 years longer than the war. And in fact, it's going to be protected by the Eisenhower administration. We also see lots of movement as a relation of World War II. And many people experienced new places during the war and stayed in those places. Also, where are the war industries built? That's also going to bring employment to LA, Detroit, Seattle, Baton Rouge, and Louisiana. We also see, because of these openings of industrial jobs, lots of blacks moving to new places. And now, for the first time in a major movement out of the South and moving into the North and the West, this is now what was a Southern problem with race relations is now a national race problem, which of course is going to immediately cause the civil rights movement to emerge after World War II. Why are so many blacks leaving the South? Not only available jobs, but also jobs diminishing in the South because a new creation in 1944 with the mechanical cotton picker. Of course, many African Americans continuing to work in agricultural jobs for almost a century after the end of the Civil War. Those jobs are simply not available with new machinery. And because of this, we see a mass movement out of the South. No country flourishes like the United States in World War II. When you look at the amount of money that the United States makes, it is unprecedented with the production and the wages that are going up, even with wage controls on how much people can make. And this is really the major reason why the U.S. is able to win the war because of the manufacturing capabilities, producing just simply more weapons of war than any other country possibly could produce. And of course, this wartime prosperity will continue into the big post-war boom in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Japanese, in December 7th, 1941, not just Pearl Harbor was attacked, they simultaneously attacked Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, what Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister of Japan, called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, looking to free Japan from dependence on Western goods. And so moving into the Philippines, the U.S., the only one not currently fighting the Nazis, was able to fight off the Japanese for 5 months before surrendering. General Douglas MacArthur is going to famously say, "People of the Philippines, I will return," goes, evacuates to Australia to lead the defense there, and then, of course, will be part of the island hopping campaign, the leapfrogging campaign on the way back to Japan in a couple of years. And the turning point battle in the Pacific is the Battle of Midway. This is in June of 1942, and this is actually a counterattack against the Japanese. As the Japanese move to attack Midway, the Americans have decoded the Japanese code purple. They know the attack is coming, and Admiral Nimitz is able to catch the Japanese aircraft carriers with their planes still on the carrier. This is going to allow a rout of Japanese forces, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Tojo tells the emperor, the Americans have avenged Pearl Harbor at Midway. This is the turning point battle in the Pacific. From this point forward, the Japanese are not moving away from their home island. The Allies are moving towards Japan. That strategy of island hopping or leapfrogging is going to be led by 2 American war leaders, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. And this is moving over the heavily fortified islands and moving to the less fortified islands, conquering those islands, building airfields there, and then bombing the fortified islands to be able to then invade. This is a very, very successful strategy as the Americans quickly move, I should say the Allies quickly move throughout the Pacific on their way to Japan. Over in the Atlantic, of course, it is about dealing with the Nazis and their U-boats, the wolf packs, sinking 500 merchant ships. This changes the following year in 43 because of new technology, sonar, radar, the bombing of U-boat bases, and perhaps most importantly, the breaking of Enigma, the German code, knowing when these attacks were coming, able to protect American merchant ships by sending in reinforcements in the nick of time. The turning point battles in Europe, we've got a couple. One in North Africa, which the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, the Nazi leader, is making a move to the Suez Canal to cut off the lifelines of oil. This is going to cause the Americans and especially the British to counterattack at El Alamein. Dave, why don't we just put him on the leash? We can put him on the leash if he's being disruptive. Sorry, Crash the puppy. So victory at El Alamein secures North Africa. This is going to allow the Allies to move through North Africa on their way into Italy. And then the more important battle, the defense at Stalingrad. The Russians stopped the Nazi long siege of Stalingrad. And this is the turning point battle, like Midway, the most east that the Nazis get into Russia. Now the Soviet Union marches west towards Germany. Stalin, however, is in desperate need of help. By 1942, they have lost 20 million people, and including citizens. When you look at the death total here, 13.6 million military deaths, and that doesn't include civilians. Tremendous amount of loss of life in the hands of the Russians. Once again, they lost the most in World War I as well. And so Stalin desperately asked the Allies to open up a second front. And so we have Dwight D. Eisenhower launch what we call Operation Torch. He's going to lead an attack into North Africa. And that is where they have the Casablanca Conference, which is the discussions of moving into Italy. And trying to push the Italians out of the war, and what the British call the attack on the soft underbelly of Europe. And of course, Italy doesn't prove to be a soft underbelly of Europe. It proves to be a real hot point of fighting and violence. The Casablanca Conference, the first of our three conferences that we need to know, and this is the discussions of moving into Italy. The invasion of Italy, it's going to come through the island of Sicily down to the south. Mussolini is overthrown there. Italy surrenders, and then Italy is going to come back on the side of the Allies, as they did in World War I as well. However, the Germans do not surrender Italy. The Germans continue to fight within Italy. And in fact, Italy is really not a successful battleground for the Allies. While, of course, Italy changes course and fights for the Allies, the Germans don't surrender in Italy until 5 days before their overall surrender. And so it's not like the Allies quickly move through Italy on their way to Germany. What Italy did was provide a distraction that brought some troops away from the Soviet Union and distracted forces from Russia and to a lesser extent France, who's already been conquered. But the negative, of course, is that the Soviets are now moving towards Germany, and every land that they conquer, like Poland or Romania, are going to be occupied by the Russians, both during the war and then after the war as satellite states. Our second conference is the Tehran Conference. The Tehran Conference is the discussion of the attack into mainland Western Europe. The Soviets are going to come from the east, the Allies will come from the west, and of course that sets up June 6, 1944, which is D-Day, the biggest amphibious invasion in world history. 3 million fighting men gathered in Britain to cross the English Channel, led by an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Operation Overlord, moving in to French Normandy. We talked a lot about the specifics of this one. All we need to know from this one here is that through a heavily American-led invasion in which the Americans took heavy casualties, especially at Omaha Beach, the Allies are able to secure a beachhead in France and then quickly move in more and more Allied forces until France is going to be liberated by the Allies here. And you can see the movements of British forces and American forces. The British come into Scandinavia, liberating Belgium and the Netherlands, while the Americans move through also on their way east to Germany, liberating whoever they pass along the way. The last stand for the Germans, an offensive, Hitler's last gamble, is what becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge. Once again, an offensive through the Ardennes forest, trying to break American lines. They push through on their way to kill the supply chain of American forces. American reinforcements arrive just in the nick of time, stop the attack, cause a German surrender, and from that point forward, it is going to be an Allied victory. The Allies arrive in Berlin. Berlin surrenders. Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, and then Germany surrenders, which is May 8th, 1945. That's VE Day. And guys, that was 75 years ago Friday, which is pretty crazy. One of the very, very unfortunate parts of this is that FDR, in his fourth term now, missed VE Day by less than a month. He died on April 12th of a cerebral hemorrhage in his brain. And unfortunately, he did not live to see the victory in Europe, which would have made him very, very happy. Of course, the Japanese are still kicking. They're still alive. They're still fighting. However, it is very, very drastic in the Pacific. American submarines are causing havoc on the Japanese merchant marine. 50% of their merchant fleet sunk. Starvation is becoming a very serious issue. Daily bombing, and then some very controversial tactics used by the Allies, such as the firebomb raid on Tokyo, killing 83,000 people in just 2 days. And so these attacks are certainly debated and controversial, as Japan really at that point did not have a means to fight back on a large scale. However, the Japanese losing land very quickly. The island hopping continues to be successful. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, two of the Japanese home islands captured in 1945. This is where the Japanese start using the divine wind tactic, the kamikaze pilots loading their planes with explosives and crashing them into American vessels. However, this now represented the desperation of the Japanese defense. At this stage, we have another conference, which is our Potsdam Conference. What's our situation? This conference is a discussion between now, unfortunately, FDR has passed. It is Truman, it is Stalin, and it is a actual two different groups of British leaders. First, it's Churchill. Then Churchill loses his party, loses majority in the British Parliament. So then it's Clement Attlee. They come in to negotiate what to do with Europe after the war and what to do with Japan. Japan is still fighting. The Potsdam Declaration says, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The alternative is prompt and utter destruction." Leaflets are dropped with this declaration down in Japan, and yet the Japanese do not like that unconditional surrender because they look at their emperor Hirohito as a divine ruler, and it simply just cannot be done that they would unconditionally surrender. We don't know if there's no conditions, what could happen, and so that is the term that cannot be met. And because of this, they respond with a very ambiguous response, and Americans take this. Truman takes this as the go-ahead to drop the nuclear bombs. Two nuclear bombs 3 days apart. The first one is Little Boy in Hiroshima. The second, Fat Man on Nagasaki. The Little Boy killing a total of 120,000 people when you count radiation and the fires that ensued that burned for 3 days. And then Fat Man somewhere around 60 to 80,000. And so unprecedented weapons being used in these conflicts. And from that point, the Japanese surrender on Ali's birthday, September 2nd, 1945. The Japanese ask one condition for their surrender. Can they keep Hirohito on the throne? The Allies accept, and the war is over. September 2nd, 1945. The Allies are victorious. Guys, that is the end. I know this was an incredibly long screencast. My voice hurts, but we are at the end of the course, the last lecture that you guys will have to hear me make, which is kind of sad in a way too. But you guys are now done. I will post the DBQ right now for you guys to work on. And I hope you guys enjoyed some of this. All right, bye.